Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the early summer event for Oxford Technology and Media. Fascinating one for our particular audience tonight. I think I owe an apology because I put engaging with the human spirit. I took Matt's sort of big ethos on, and several people said to me, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, you're here, so that's clearly its work." But this is such an important area for our industry, both on the technology side and also on the content side, understanding what a value is in what you're creating, and then equally on the other side of the business saying, well, what can we fund? How can we actually drive commerce and business based on what's been created? This has been a gap that has been driven guesswork down the years. Is this film going to make it? Is this TV show going to work? So from a media perspective, this is very exciting. But of course, other events have overtaken us. Someone asked me, is this anything to do with Cambridge Analytica? I said, no. But that shadow overhangs us about how people have used data and things for perhaps purposes they weren't intended. So there's quite a wide range of implications for what we're going to kind of see. But first of all, I'd just like to, thank Matt very much, and Evgeniya and Marlene for coming all the way down from London. I've known Matt for quite a while, and we've talked about how the work that he's done and the team has done in this space with the BBC, and it's been utterly fascinating. So I'm going to ask them all to give it a short introduction to themselves and how they've ended up working in this space shortly. But I do think that this is just one of the critical things for us as this group, is just this whole convergence, as Anthony always said, sitting between technology and media, and this is it. So thank you very much for coming. And thank you very much also to Grant Thornton and Threes, who kindly support these events for us as our sponsors. Thank you very much. And without further ado, I'm going to allow each of you to introduce yourselves, and then we're going to have a little bit of presentation, and then fire in the Q&As at the end. Thank you. Super.
Cool. Awesome. First of all, thanks, Tony, for having us here, and thank you, everyone, for taking a little bit of precious time out of your Mondays to hear us talk about some of the work we've been doing. We do have some fun stuff to get through today. We're going to walk through, we're going to take a little bit more of a holistic level so that we're all kind of on the same playing field, and then dive straight into some of the findings we found in the media space. I'm also going to verbally share some new findings off of 5 years of looking at emotion, behavior, and claimed feedback data with over 87 markets and about 2.5 billion data points. So we have some really interesting stuff around the media space, but I really appreciate your time. We always love presenting this stuff and sharing it, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. I'd like to introduce a couple of people from our team. So I founded the company, but quite frankly, not even close to the brains that we have here. So Evgeniya is from the data side and front-end development, and Marlene is from the design side, human design. But why don't you give a little bit of background?
Yeah, so my name is Evgeniya. I'm a software developer, and I joined CrowdEmotion around a bit more than a month ago. I've been working in Sky before that, in a digital team. I was a lead developer there. And then I decided I needed a bit more to get back to a bit more mathematical challenges, because I graduated from maths. So yeah, I decided I want to go into machine learning and artificial intelligence, and that's how I ended up in CrowdEmotion. So yeah.
I'm Marlene. I did my PhD for Jaguar Land Rover in human-centered design. I looked at emotions in the automotive environment and what impacts emotion have. Then I started working for Jaguar Land Rover as a human factors designer and a human-machine interaction specialist, and then decided to join CrowdEmotion as a human behavior designer to look for a more innovative young environment.
Cool. So I think we're going to kick off with a little bit of a video, and then we'll dive into kind of the premise behind CrowdEmotion and where we're going. So then you can join us for the journey. But let's start with a little bit of bug eating. Dinner time.
Oh my goodness. This one has been living in there a very, very long time. I'm not going to need to eat for a week after this one.
Pound for pound, insects like these contain more protein than beef or fish.
So, good old Bear Grylls. What you're actually looking at here is, I think everybody went, oh, at about the same time, where you see that peak. And that peak is actually an analysis of 1,500 people's facial expressions. So this is the type of information you start to get from the sensors in our world today. And helps us understand a little bit more about the storytelling. But what you also see here is that a number of people reacted in different ways. I'd say about 10% of you had some sort of facial occlusion, so you put a hand in front of your face. But actually most of you had a big smile, and it was that cringe, so I was like, oh. Which is interesting because we started to do some work around disgust itself as an emotional state. And there's many different types of disgust, but it's a really fun one to play around with. So let's just pop to the next one here. I want to go more holistically for a second and have a think about why you mentioned media and technology is coming together. There we go, perfect. I mean, last year was a pretty significant year. It was the first year that more media spend went to digital environments than it did to television, which fundamentally changes the game. We're talking about a $250 billion industry of media spend, and that is fundamentally changing because before we had one platform that we knew how to measure. And we've got some experts in the room who know how to measure media in the television space. How do you measure organic uplift in Instagram? It's no tools. It's nothing. If you want to measure anything on the Facebook platform, you have to go to Facebook. And you have to get them to measure it. And they have veto power over whether they share that data or not. But you're still going to spend almost 50% of your budget with them. That's millions of pounds. We're at a stage in the world right now where our environments are empowered with sensors everywhere, where our personal data is pretty much everywhere, where how we interact with environments is becoming much more and more human-like, okay? And this creates an ecosystem that is transformationally different than anything we've ever seen. But what's interesting, for the past 100 years, we've been building technology and teaching people to conform to that technology. A really good example that I love, it might be a little bit confusing, but I absolutely love, is the hashtag. So the hashtag was actually first really came to popularity, not by Twitter, but actually by the telephone. Because when AT&T went from rotary dial to the punch phone, they had to fill out the 2 extra slots. And the actual symbols that they chose initially were very playful, but they couldn't be recognized by a machine. And as soon as they said, oh, well, actually, if you want people to check your banking, you needed to be able to make that searchable and referenceable by a machine. So they had to change how humans behaved so that we could articulate and communicate with the machine. And we've been doing that ever since. All of our systems are very, very binary. But with sensor information, sensor data, they become much more complex. And then the only way to actually make the sensor information work and understand how people behave in their environment is actually to go back to how does a human interpret that in the first place. So we almost have to switch the paradigm. We're going through a conformity, almost tide reversal. It's a very interesting time right now. But I also think the other thing is that we are dealing with exponential amounts of data. So as you can see here, not only is the interaction changing, but the data is changing at a massive rate. And we can store it, and we can process it. And that all can happen. Now, relevancy is a big question here. God, the amount of information that we just processed, and I can tell you, 2 things were very relevant. So there you go, 5 years of data, 2.5 billion data points, and out of the first audit, only 2 things were actually relevant. Very interesting things, and they actually drive a lot of other things that we think and notionally know are relevant, but don't have, we're using kind of econometrics models to stitch it all together in a human narrative. Another one is online spend. That's where our shopping's gone to. So if our storytelling for brands is going in a particular direction, we need to think about our conversion funnel and how that fundamentally changes. And then of course, privacy, which is one of my favorites. Mainly because if you're starting to use sensor technology, there are ways to decouple the people from the information, but still offer a totally intuitive experience at an individual level. So lots of really cool stuff, lots of really cool capability, but we're really at the nascent stage of understanding how to use it all in a way that is ethical, in a way that is engaging. I mean, I think both Procter & Gamble and Unilever have now instituted advertising protocols that require positive engagement and a measurable approach to that, fundamentally shaking up the industry because they're the biggest spenders. So when you look at this, how do we understand people? Well, if we're going to contextualize the world in a people way, that's been the role of a very stagnant market research industry, which has been stuck at around 44 billion a year for the last 5-6 years. Yet big data keeps going up and up and up. We know this data is important. We know that personal data is essential to making decisions in our business. There's a massive gap. If you want to understand more data at the market research way, you have to add another human being. And that's the extent of your capability. It's a very linear progression. So how do we catch up to the actual amount of data that's coming through? How do we create systems that learn the way that a human learns? How do we create systems that articulate the world the way that humans perceive the world? So what we did is 6 years ago, I started CrowdEmotion a little bit like as an experiment. I've got 15 years in the human measurement space. I did my degree in human kinetics, and I started with measuring muscles and VO2 max against performance. I went to IMG, and then I built a sponsorship return on investment model, which ended up actually funding Wembley, the building of Wembley Stadium, because sponsorship return on investment is how you pay for stadium maintenance. And then I moved on to Vision Critical to talk to clients about how you open up 35 country discussion platforms with your customers on an ongoing basis. And then I said, well, if everybody's going onto mobile phone, they're holding 13 sensors in their hand at all times. Could we just turn the world into a lab? And then create a test environment that doesn't actually impact people, but synthetically understand the world from that information. And there's a lot of signs pointing to yes on that one. It's a very interesting stage, though. So we did find, though, from our perspective, that there are 3 key things that you kind of paradigm shifts that you have to break. One, never do AI for AI's sake. So if you're going to do that, you have to have someone from the human behavior background. We're probably the only people in the biometric space who fundamentally had psychology working with AI from day one. Then the last bit is, that's all well and good. You can understand, if you can recognize an emotion, that's fantastic. But if you can't apply it to business, it's useless. Because how are you going to fund it? You've got to make it useful. This is the classic challenge that every university faces. What I create, how do I make that useful in market? So you always have a business person. That's how we approach every single customer. So our point is about people first and always. And right now I want to hand it over to Evgeniya to talk a little bit about how we then reimagined information and people information.
So what we're currently doing is we're using data collection, data measurement tools. So in our case now, that's eye tracking, emotion recognition, and pose, which are the bigger body movements. And then basically everything that we can collect from sensors, we try to make sense of it. Then all this data is in a time series format, which means that we have X and Y is the time, and X is just all the points, what happens during in a particular amount of time, which is a very small amount of time. That's how we collect this data. But as Matt said, this data is not really useful if we don't apply it and don't relate this data to anything else. So we also try to track what people think. We managed to do that by creating surveys. So then that's how we collect what people think. Obviously, that's not what they feel, but we are getting there. So we collect what they think, and then we can also track their behavior based on their actions. So what they do after they've completed the survey, what they buy, where they go next, what they click on, that's their behavior. So ideally, our goal at the very end is that we build a model that based on people's thoughts, emotions, we get to predict their behavior. That's like the end goal. So putting all of this together is obviously the challenge. And what we built for customers, we are currently building a platform that uses these algorithms behind, but on top, clients get to personalize this platform and use it in the way they want and in the purpose that they need it for, using our algorithms. So let's say in the case of marketing research, we build a platform that allows people to create marketing companies, to create research, to create surveys. So they create these surveys from the platform, and the different thing from all other research tools out there is that we have all the data. So we have the normal data that they get back from the surveys, but we also track their emotions, because just the emotion data by itself is not relevant. But when we connect all these data together, we end up with something new, with a system that's totally guided by people. So that's what we're trying to achieve here.
There we've got one of my favorite quotes. We must design for how people behave and not how we want them to behave. Can we move to the next one? Okay. So what we've experienced is that businesses are quite often basing their decision making on data and technology. We don't think that's right. We want to move towards the human. That's why we're applying human-centered design. These are a few of the strategies. So important is the understanding of users, their tasks and the environment, involve the users in the design and development, use an iterative process, address the whole user experience, and include multidisciplinary skills and perspectives. The way we're doing that in the client onboarding process is with a design and iteration sprint. The design sprint is a 5-day process to answer critical business questions, design, map, prototype, and get to actual user testing. The great thing about it is that you skip two steps that just make the process very long. So we're skipping build and launch. We get from idea directly to LAN. So we know if the product is successful before we develop it. So you get clear data from a realistic prototype and then move into the development. So the design sprint that we are hosting for the clients is a very short, intense, and agile process, but a lot of fun. We've got 2 workshop days that involve the clients and then 2 days that are more on our side. What the clients get out of it is fully aligned teams, a product direction, a defined user journey and roadmap, a working tested prototype, and a shift to a more human-centered focus.
So I think, just to quickly draw that out, with the data model, what we did find is that emotions, whilst they standing on their own, they're good for very few things, I'd say. We found that they enhanced a lot of the relevancy of the other data. So you could very quickly identify whether if somebody said they appreciated or didn't appreciate something, or how they felt about something, whether that was actually relevant to the end goal of whatever the media was trying to achieve. So that was one big thing. The second thing about the design process, I think we were experiencing 18-month adoption cycles, okay, to help, and the BBC was one of our first ones, to help the BBC get from a point of, okay, we need to test, does this information make sense? How do we link it back into the business, all of that. And now you can get it down into a full 6-week cycle from a 1-week design sprint. You get a prototype out, start collecting data, and then you have the information back into their executives within 6 weeks. So it fundamentally, all the feedback on the process is that it fundamentally reframes how they think about making decisions within the organization, which is actually the first challenge with this type of data. Right, so let's get into the media space real quick about how we then applied this to people like the BBC. What's really interesting, so the BBC was an interesting one because the first bit of work we did was actually more around long form narrative. and long-form content like Sherlock, Doctor Who, that type of stuff. What they specifically wanted to find out is if they were selling their media to 120 different markets, which is how they make about 1.6 billion pounds a year, where do they spend their marketing budget, which is about up to 400 billion pounds? Where do they spend that budget to optimize against the long tail? Because they know they're going to sell Sherlock, they know they're going to sell Doctor Who, but life is tough. Where are they going to sell that? And that was where the big questions came from them. And that our initial study was, we did about 20,000 people across 22 markets, and we had 40 different trailers. And then we showed them that, and then we had them rank that. We also looked at their emotional disposition. And it was quite interesting from the standpoint of really understanding, and we found, and this was also one of our big findings from this very recent study, we haven't published the white paper yet, so for you guys first, is that emotional data, this time series data, is actually orthogonal, which means it has no predictive power against claimed data. It's not surprising, but it's very useful, because it immediately and fundamentally calls it additive or contextual data. It means you need to use these together because they're describing different parts of the human experience. Okay, so there's a lot of emotion providers out there who have suggested that you could just measure the emotions, give that to people, and say, great, now you've got every answer you need. That's not true at all, because one is a pre-memory experience and one is a post-memory experience. So you've gone through the memory encoding process. So we developed a mechanism for then BBC to start understanding which shows to send to which markets. But when you break it down, and so what you're seeing here is you're seeing the original was appreciation. Did you like or not like on a scale of 0 to 100? 0 and 100, okay? But what you're seeing here is when you add the emotional disposition of how they felt throughout the film and summarize that in a number of different ways, you actually see that you've got the same level of engagement, and actually that came true on the ratings as well. So they experimentally threw that into market, even though it was a very poorly liked show. So their general purpose was anything under 65 on here didn't go to market, okay? But they sent that to market to experiment. So it helped them identify a whole bunch of hidden revenue, which they hadn't seen. From a media planning standpoint, obviously this is incredible. But what's also interesting is now the algorithms are getting strong enough at the individual level, you could start to cluster audiences and see specific audiences. So rather than going out to market and saying, I am making this film for that audience, you could just say, I'm making this film, test it, great. It's going to this audience, that's where it's working really well, and here's where it's a niche. And so it turns the whole data element around and works towards more probabilistic media buying, which becomes very important when you have to buy across 7 different environments instead of 1. So television versus all the social, out-of-home, experiential. So it's about defining that experience. If we go back one, from a creative element, then we started to work with the advertising group of BBC News. And of course, they're all about telling creative storytelling and how do we get through to it. The key for them, and for a number of media and creative agencies, or ad agencies specifically, was how do we create diagnostics off of engagement? Because frankly, just because somebody clicks on something, doesn't really matter. How do we make it really tangible? And so they use emotional time series here, plus eye tracking. What are people looking at? How they're feeling, all synced up to the piece of media itself so that you can make edits, cuts, and that type of stuff. And some of the other findings that we're finding here is that actually certain types of emotional movements directly link to memory testing. So we test this with a memory test on either side, and emotions are very predictive of shift in memory, certain combinations of them. So emotional engagement, predictive of shift in memory. Shift in memory can be used for a lot of econometric modeling, but it's getting closer and closer to that behavioral point. So you want to show the video on that one? Yeah, that's all right. So this is an Audi ad. And they had to say, what is a smart vehicle? So here's the emotional time series down here. What you're looking at up top is the heat map from eye tracking. So the challenge that they have is they have a lot of, it's called centering, when they just look at the middle. We want to see that eye tracking start to move away. So here we go. So their engagement from an attention standpoint really started to uptick at around 30 seconds.
While my thoughts were busy hatching, if I only had a brain.
So one of the problems with a lot of advertising, of course, is it is the centering issue. In fact, a lot of advertising is built that way. Hit you with a whole bunch of images right at the center of the screen so your eyes don't move. Okay, but eyes moving really indicates a lot of memory encoding and attention engagement. Then we look at the emotional time series on it. The challenge that this particular ad had is that the emotional time series came before the attention hit. So there was a lot of centering at the beginning, not a lot of movement, even to what was being written. And the emotional stuff was coming at the beginning, so that was okay. Then once the attention hit, the emotional stuff had dissipated. So then they have an issue in creative that they need to switch those around. So these are the types of pieces of information you can then start to apply when you're creating media, serving media, or consulting on media. I think that was all we had, isn't it?
I'm trapped in this. Sorry, trying to fix it.
Is that enough?
So,
Yeah.
let us open the floor for questions. I've got a few.
Oh. Why don't we have a seat?
It's just sort of, as we're still on that slide, I mean,
Yeah.
What did you have to say when they saw that the logo at the end, this strike of the sky?
Well, I mean, these are weighted. So actually, your biggest one is cognitive engagement and puzzlement, if you want to call it that. Now, these are using the Ekman 6, which, again, take those with a very big grain of salt. It's a universal model that uses academic labels. So whether the person's actually feeling puzzlement is a very big question. It's more whether they're cognitively engaged. So they're making this look, okay? And that's also highly correlated with disgust as well. But I take it with a grain of salt. We found that, for example, rejection was actually a really big way. So disgust was a big way to actually engage people in right memory encoding, oddly enough. So it's like negative advertising. So you show something disgusting to get them to positively think like about eco-friendliness was an interesting one for Huawei that we picked up. Yeah.
You knew I was going to ask a question anyway. This is going to be a multiple one. I'm interested in how you go about designing the panel that sits underneath all of this. Because you've got a group of people. Are they consistent over time? Are they demographically representative of the geography that you're in, wherever you may be in? And how do you decide on the number of people that are part of that process? And how do you get them always to have the recognition device always on in terms of where they're looking at this?
So just break down the question. The first one is around the sample itself. Yeah. So the audience. How do we make sure the audience is consistent? I guess the question you have to ask there, is an audience ever consistent? And I don't believe it is, especially since emotional information is telling us that actually people change the way that they react to things almost on a daily basis. So it's more about how they encode into memory. So I think demographics, first of all, is fundamentally the wrong way to look at it. And I've
been asked that by the BBC there.
yeah. So they apply their own models, right? So they've asked for my approach. What's interesting is because of the way that the brain works. I mean, you have to sit there and go like, demographically to assume that all males age 35 in the UK are the same. I think it's a pretty drastic assumption. Yeah. The problem is that I have not seen panels that actually really have good deep profiling yet, that weren't privately curated. Or at least anything that we're seeing on the market. I mean, we pour through all the APIs of most of the panels. So,
but if you flip that, then
yeah.
You're talking to Audi, say,
yeah,
and Audi want to have your view on their advert.
Sure.
And they equally, through BBC Worldwide, want to have their advert against the appropriate content in the appropriate market. So how do you then define what that is?
It's more about the environment interaction, right?
We need to take this off, because we can go on like this all night.
Yeah, well, I mean, it goes back to, it's really the relationship between a person and the environment. So with the BBC, and demographically is a very common way of still buying media. So I think that's fine. We're going to get into it, in my view, in 10 years, we'll be at emotional real-time bidding, and that's fine. But at this point, we're making the transition from traditional, but we've applied it to digitally, probably incorrectly.
And the trouble is, actually, the industry does not want to move.
Of course not.
So all the advertising agencies
But they're going to, because
stuck in demographic land, age, gender.
Sure.
That's
But they don't own the environment anymore. That's why. Yeah. And then the second one, the second part of your question was around.
Well, that's a good question, isn't it? It was around how you decided on the actual sheer volume of the panelists. So you average what, 1.5 to 2,000.
So we typically try and do about 250 to 300 exposures per piece of content. And then we kind of let it self-drive. If they want to do another one, then they can. The other thing is you don't have to, there's other ways to do it than panel, right? So we've got paid media options, we've got intercept options. A lot of our platform is built to, the key here is about understanding your value proposition. When you're a publisher or media holder, you're a rights holder, right? So you actually own the environment that they're in, and you own the content that's curating that environment. So you need to be able to define that and then say, where's the brand fit? Is that brand fit with this particular journalist or that journalist? Does it have different engagement rates on which part of the site? So being able to articulate that, you need to create the model from that perspective first, and that's how you define your audience, rather than going, yeah, they're males 35 in England, because that just, again, doesn't make sense. I think the big special thing that probably gets lost a little bit here is by creating a currency, by creating a common metric between a person and their environment, which we believe is memory, which has a huge relevant value. Emotions are just part of the process, but they're not the process. But the relationship between emotions and what people say is a really good way to get an idea of memory. By creating that as a currency, you can apply that to every environment that's out there. So it finally becomes agnostic. And by becoming agnostic, you don't have to worry about a click rate in one environment, a view in another environment, and an experiential feedback form in another environment. So we need to create a currency and a common metric, and that doesn't exist today. But that's where our system is going.
Because if I pick up from your comment earlier about, you're going to have a film and you're going to put it out there.
Yeah.
Presumably with that film, the bidding market you're talking about coming forward is you're going to be saying, here are the various rating attributes of this film, and people will then bid on whether that fits with the audience they want, either in terms of advertising or in terms of theatres or distribution in those terms. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, does it really well align with my audience, or if it doesn't, what's the good reason for bringing it in? If it's an audience, I mean, it's a three-part model, right? You have an audience, you have the rights holder, and you have the brand. In the case of branded content.
So if we sort of step back to the elements of that, you then say, okay, I'm a cinema in, say, Norway, for example. I mean, there is some quite sophisticated thinking about those environments in terms of their audiences going forward, but quite often some of the more fragmented organisers wouldn't really be able to give you today an idea, that there's a sort of a traditional view of audiences, but they wouldn't really be able to give you that level of detail. So have they got to get there first, or do the content owners have to put it out there? How do you actually drive that change?
The brands drive the change. They already are.
Okay.
Unilever and Procter & Gamble they need a common metric around engagement. They've already asked for it, and they've already laid out their criteria for it. So because that's where the money is.
Yes.
Yeah, go where the money is. The money always dictates, but the brands are calling for it. The question is, for all those traditional media owners, is how do I stay relevant enough to those brands so that I can still get those dollars?
Okay.
Because what they've faced for the last 5 years is Google and Facebook are taking 52% of the industry. So my budgets have just been halved just because Google exists.
Okay.
So they're looking for options. The problem is they don't have the budget or the data savviness to be able to get to Google. So they're staring down the barrel of a gun. They
It's not only that, the actual platforms have expanded
Yeah.
beyond Leaf as well, so
Yeah.
they're being squeezed in every different direction.
they're staring down the barrel of a gun. Yeah.
So you're talking about the advertising side of things, but you say you work with the BBC.
Yeah.
So from a media point of view, they're not looking for advertising money. What have you been able to show them, say with Sherlock and Doctor Who, that they didn't know for selling it, for getting it out around the world? What have you shown them and taught them that's different?
Yeah, so we for them it was long tail. So it's where Netflix makes its money, right? Netflix, they'll take or how they started, same with Amazon Prime, they all pulled the same thing. Go get a couple of feature shows and then give you a whole bunch of other stuff that was probably only shown on one channel in one country somewhere. So for them it's about monetizing the long tail and then being able to drive rating value. Now rating value, I mean there's a ton of questions around how rating values are accumulated, but it's the best measurement system at the time. So with them, we were able to identify a number of shows that were immediately dismissed from going to market and being sold into market, identifying where to put them into market, where to put them in the broadcasting schedule. We increased we beat primetime average by 67% and slot averages by about 123% on average. In Australia, Australia was the test market for us. So they identified a whole bunch of shows down there that just never would have even made it. And the thing is, when you're BBC worldwide, you've got a catalog of 30,000 titles, right? How do you even sort that? They've got 5 different systems to sort it. They got one system that handles their legal rights. For them to even pull a show, it takes about 2.5 weeks to understand whether they can even take it to a market. And you got to do that 30,000 times in a time period of 4 months.
But they have to do it.
No, they don't. That's the problem. That's the fundamental issue. They don't do it. So when you have an increasing revenue target, then you sit there and go, okay, I just can't sort through my system. That's their issue. That's their fundamental issue. So they have to know where to look first.
And that's what you can do.
So that's what we've helped them do, is they've identified where they specifically look in the catalog, then they can pull that information and say, is it sellable to market? There's a whole bunch of other stuff you could do on top of this. Yeah.
So can you give us a concrete example of it?
Life is Tough was a really good example. That was the specific. That was the number 4 show. That was the show. This visual that we're going to bring up, that was real data. That was their information that we're allowed to share. So that was one where it was very poorly rated, but it had the same rating as Doctor Who from an engagement perspective, and that one absolutely nailed it. I mean, they made a lot of money off that.
Do you know why it had been overlooked?
Oh, because it was the worst rated. So the research had said it was the worst rated show.
And that research, but how was that research?
So the typical research, they send a bunch of pilots to market and they ask you to rate it, appreciate it, 0 to 100.
So tick a box.
No, it's slider scale, 0 to 100. Did you like, not like it? And then they do all kinds of other stuff around kind of your attitudes and interest and all the stuff that goes into the ratings data. To try and predict it in that sense. All we did is ask them to turn on a webcam, which was actually your second question. How do you turn it on? All we did is ask them to turn on a webcam while they were watching it. That's the only difference that we did to that whole method. And by doing that, we got the emotional time series. And then by summarizing the emotional time series in a couple of proprietary ways, we found a way that was rather consistent and allowed us to then lay out an audience from an engagement perspective of reaction. Expressional reaction.
So life is tough. Sorry, you go.
So, coming from a creative background, as many here do, is this data or this approach, do you foresee it being exploited to manipulate the content itself? I mean, there's long been obviously an aim in film and what have you to actually manipulate the audience and what have you.
In what way?
Well, their emotions, and to sort of, we know that they have screenings to see if they should change the end or do this or do that. Would your sort of data be added to that toolkit? Do you foresee?
I'm a bit of a purist, to be perfectly honest. I think people should be left to storytelling and just tell the story. And I think the issue we have is that a lot of stories are lost simply because people didn't have the information to support why it should be distributed. That's my philosophical approach. Now, on a data side, you can use this data. We did this really interesting experiment with Storyworks, BBC's branded content, to celebrate Attenborough's his 90th. And what was really interesting about that was they were creating an app. And so they had 20 minutes of footage from the Hunt series and the Predator series. And what we did is we did one that was strictly algorithmically driven. So I had never seen the footage. I just went into the time series. I took the 3 biggest spikes and literally took them as from this second to this second, this second to this second. It turns out when you actually mapped it up with the frames, it was within like 2% margin, which is pretty incredible. But I think the other aspect is that we had to make a 60-second ad. And it's on YouTube, so I'll share the YouTube link so you can take a look. We presented it at Cannes. But it was really interesting. So we had the algorithmic one, and then they had one of their directors do one totally creatively. And then we measured those. And the algorithmic one it was quite interesting. The algorithmic one did better emotionally, but the creative one did better from a likability. So it would have rated higher, but the algorithmic one was over here. And then what we did is we gave that data, and I walked the creator through that data, and they created a final one based off of that data. Swapped out almost 70% of the content. Her choice, she could take nothing, take it all. But she ended up taking about 70% of the content, and actually it improved both. It improved both measures. And it was the same, so we actually went back to the exact same viewer, so we had to account for that bias. But it was a really interesting outcome and she said she really enjoyed the experience from that standpoint. But as a creator, I mean, I'd be reticent to have this data dictate what I should be doing, because it shouldn't. It's a tool, right? But information, feedback from your audience, every storyteller wants feedback. When I present and I see people yawning, that's feedback. I take that feedback and go, great, I gotta ramp it up. I gotta stop talking. But that's feedback, and that's really important feedback. And I appreciate that as someone who has to tell our story a lot. So I don't know. I think, for me, I think it's about empowering a creator with the information they need, so when they get to the distribution question for funding their creation, they're just as empowered as the big studio that comes down the line with Marvel backing them or whatever it is. Like, I want them to have that information so that they don't get cut out of the entire industry because Sundance said so. That's my view. So we got one back there.
This might be a stupid question. Are facial expressions culturally universal?
No, it's not a stupid question. There's a huge debate in the academic world. Our view, from looking at over 500,000 people across 87 different countries, the muscle movements, because we're anatomically similar, are fine. I think it's a pretty big assumption, and actually I think it's the wrong way to build the model. So if you build an algorithm that assumes cultural universality, then you have to go and map out every culture's nuance to that. So that's a model that like Affectiva has taken, and it's the way to approach that type of problem, and it has been for years. I think they've changed it since. We started a little bit of a different way. We have it so that the vectors on your face, we start looking at difference, but within the first 5 frames of filming you, we start to create your norm. And every time you increase your vector, we get a retrospective normalization. So we understand what your maximum facial expression reaction is versus your minimum. I also don't believe in the 6 emotion universality, but don't tell too many people that. We do a lot of arousal valence work behind the scenes to find the features that are actually relevant. And also, basing a whole system on facial expressions is a mistaken approach. We have attention, we have emotion, we have thought. There's a reason why you blend. These are all additive value metrics, right? So a lot of times thought is pretty concrete in a sense, but it's not hitting the full predictive capability. So we would see thought get to about, let's say, 30% predictive. By adding emotions, you can bump it almost up to 80% predictive, emotions and attention in some scenarios.
I sort of totally get how this is useful in a business sense.
Sure.
But I can't help thinking that media publishers would grasp the opportunity to have real-time feedback if they possibly could.
Yeah.
So just one question about input devices. I mean, if you're wearing a Fitbit or an Apple Watch or something, you can monitor people's heart rates, and that presumably will be quite a useful additional bit of information.
You can also monitor their heart rate from the camera too.
But last week, I think it was, the San Francisco board decided to ban facial recognition in San Francisco.
Yep.
So there seems to me a little bit of tension building here between what's acceptable, humanly acceptable, and what the industry might like if it could really have it. So how do you see that sort of playing out?
I see it as it's a point, this is a little bit politically charged, to be fair. So I see it, I should probably couch my words.
Go for it.
All right. Well, I see it a little bit like Brexit and like Trump administration, like what we're seeing. Frankly, we're seeing a lot of polarization right now. That'll eventually pass. I'm not too concerned. I think as long as you build your system in a way that promotes good actors to use it, then I think you're okay. There's also a big difference between facial recognition and facial coding, which are two different things. Facial recognition is the identity of somebody as an individual. Facial coding is understanding expression. In fact, we found a way to, we're very close, it's very exciting, to get facial coding happening on the device so that actually it can understand how you're feeling, but I never see your video because it never comes back to my server. All we get back is the metadata that somebody, somewhere at this sensor point.
There's a sort of big element of trust involved in that, isn't there? And that's, it's all very well. I mean, in the West, we might sort of be happy to accept all of that, but you've only got to watch what happens in China to know that you can't necessarily trust.
I agree there's an element of trust, but that's kind of, in any technology, there's an element of trust. Yeah. I don't think it's any different.
Well, it's not any different, but it's another boundary that's being pushed with this type of approach. I mean, I think it's fascinating, but...
Well, I mean, London covered that boundary a long time ago by putting CCTV everywhere. I mean, that boundary has been pushed.
Well, for facial recognition, yeah, but not for the assessment of emotion.
But every participant has the free choice.
Yeah.
They told before what they're participating in.
I mean, I was looking.
No. To your point, a more broad scale. Yeah. So you'd never flip on somebody's camera from the source side. You would always flip it on. Somebody would have to flip on their camera. We would, like the way we designed our systems, it's an automatic opt out. They'd have to opt in, right? So you'd have to flip on the camera in order for that to take.
Yeah, and then we hear that Alexa, speech reported by Alexa is being farmed on somebody's servers, and nobody quite knows how it happened.
Sure, the media gets a lot of stuff wrong.
I think you've got to, if you're going to do those kind of systems, you've got to have some kind of ethical policy that says, here's what happens when you do it. And that has, because the realization has followed the activity, I think. We're going backwards into what have we signed up for here now. I think that, the whole election thing has driven that question about what's going on now. But I think there's given what you were saying about not needing video anymore, just getting metadata.
Yeah.
I mean, the temptation.
It actually gets rid of that problem.
It's you can get the metadata, but you might just say it's an anonymous basis, and actually that could be quite powerful because you say, well, I'm giving the data and nobody knows it's me, and actually you can get quite a big pool of data off that. I would think.
Do you know? Have you read? Are you familiar with Nick Chater from Work?
No, I've just finished reading Hannah Fry's book about use of algorithms, and I mean, another question I had was about how an algorithm, the assumptions built in an algorithm get amplified by sort of machine learning type of repetition. And so
it can do, yeah, you have to be careful with some of that. But I think you have a really good response to this one. I mean, what's better? Is it a human or a machine to be doing this type of assessment?
I actually really like your approach, and I think the human element is really important. But I think if you're designing systems that are algorithmically based, there's a responsibility on you to publish your assumptions, because I think there's always a danger that you've missed that you've taken some unconscious bias into what you've written.
Well, why don't you talk about your unconscious bias?
Well, it's a very, very popular question when it comes to the bias in machine learning altogether. And what happens when your data is biased, because then you build your algorithm, but it feeds the data and the data is biased itself. So what do you do then?
Yeah, so
but you get the same.
It's the old thing, really.
Exactly, but the difference is when it comes to the algorithm, you can actually, the person building the algorithm, have ways to detect that. So we actually have ways to detect when there is bias, and we have ways to change that.
Are you building that
So,
in by way of algorithms? Are you using inductive algorithms as opposed to deductive to take it to the level that...
I mean, we don't call it inductive or deductive, but...
No, it's just most of the AI platforms, you take anything, Watson, blah, 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 they're all based on deductive.
Yeah.
There's no human input, and that's the deductive element. When you get inductive, that's where you get the human overlay, whether that is coded or directed.
Well, yeah. So yeah. I mean, there's always a human overlay with it. You have to. The biggest thing we probably learned is that, and this is something that I love, and I have published actually in the world of market research, because poor market researchers sitting there in a very stagnant industry with extremely shrinking pressures. Yeah. And what they're going like, well, what's my job in the next 5 years? Because there's over 850 tools in market research. There's over 850 monolithic platforms on how to ask a human a question or understand something about a human. And that's the first fundamental challenge, is that a market researcher who's trained as a social scientist has to now go and review 850 platforms and say, I think the question you're asking is this, and here's 6 platforms that can maybe do it. I'll play with one of them and stitch it together. So one of the big things is actually backing it out and going, we've kind of over-technologied the human aspect of this. It's always about having a human in the process. And humans are really good. I kind of use this quite a bit. Technology is good at finding what is. Humans are good at finding what isn't. We're incredibly critical thinkers. We're good at creative. We're good at plugging gaps and plugging holes. We're really good at that. Technology can only read what it's given. It can look for those gaps. It can be trained to look for those things, but it has to be trained by a human to do it. And there will always be an element of a human to do that. It has to happen that way. I think it's the only way you can build moving forward.
Are you, or is anyone else looking at the same technology for things that aren't market research?
Oh yeah. So the platform. Sorry, this was a media and audiences application. So that's a market research play. So the 3 areas of interest for me. One is credit risk assessment. There's about 2 billion people who are marginalized around the world who they don't have access to a bank account because they come from a cash-based economy. You've got half of Africa that's going to leapfrog brick and mortar anyway. And so finding ways to recognize people's authenticity, I think, is very good. This provides a really good environment to do that. Healthcare, particularly with age in place. So we have massive strains on the healthcare issue. I think on healthcare as it is, the Western world is that strain's going to continue. We can't train doctors or professionals fast enough, practitioners to the same degree that we have. And so we also don't have the room or the space. So how do we convert our homes into smart homes to be able to identify Alzheimer's moments and biometric signals? So again, we're talking about emotions here. Really, that category is biometrics. And then the final one that I'm very interested in, just personally, I think it's a fascinating topic, is I think that we haven't looked at reimagining how we handle penitentiaries or the penal system as it is. And there's a lot of interior designers and architects out there who really have said, how do we look at this a little bit different to drive positive motivation, positive behavior? I mean, you can imagine sticking somebody in a cell for a long time. It is meant about as criminal punishment. The problem about punishing people is they just become more punished. And so how do we understand the impact? Does certain people respond to that, certain people don't? How do we understand the impact, and is there a way that we can reimagine that? And we've actually been approached recently by a very, very large player in that space. So again, fundamentals, you have an environment, you can hook it up with sensors, we can get biometrics, we have to implement some sort of feedback mechanism with the user, and then we have to be able to track behaviors from a non-kind of biometric driven source. So you could do that, you start to get all the measurement systems in play, to your point, that then you can algorithmically model this, which means you can look at the bias, you can change the bias, you can interchange into it.
And other people looking at it for security.
Yeah, so I mean, one of our advisors is Dr. Watson. Yeah, out of Warwick, who heads up the WMG cyber group. And my business partner built and sold a cyber business to Altron. So cyber is an area that's very interesting. But again, in cyber, it's not necessarily about catching people in the moment. It's about modeling out the human risk factors in your systems. So that's, again, the measurement. Keep in mind, the measurement system, market research is fascinating because measurement actually drives modeling, right? So the more you can measure, and this is something that Evgeniya actually, do you want to talk a little bit about?
About the surveys.
No, synthetic.
The synthetic, but yeah, I mean, the idea is that the more data we have, the more data we can input into the neural network. So the model learns by itself. That's what it's all about. So the more data you get, the model changes a little bit, and adjusts for the new data they just received. So potentially getting all these data from all these different people. At some point, we could even create the panels ourselves. So have like an example group of people synthetically generated, which having enough data could easily be done.
Yeah, we're working through the modeling of the ability to take, so to your point, could you talk in cyber? Well, cyber where? Let's say it's, let's forget the big guys. Let's actually say it's just, it's Joe Bloggs down on the high street who's got a mom and pop shop, right? And they have to worry about where all the human interaction points are for cybersecurity, if you want to talk about cyber, or even just security in general. With very little data, how do they turn 100 people into 1 million people, and then all the iterations from that. And so it's about actually creating testing systems. It's not necessarily, and models that are much more accurate to the way humans behave than it is towards actually measuring the point in time. The point in time informs the predictive capability. So I think that's a better way to look at these types of systems.
So I was listening today to the radio because we're talking about gender bias as well. They were talking about the fact in the health industry, so many pills and medicines and things are designed for males, and they don't work for women because we're physically different shapes, different sizes.
Yeah, totally.
In fact, within the males, they don't always work from big to small or whatever. Is that, how is that working with this? Because you need gender in some instances, and then you don't want gender biases in, say, the health industry, things like that, in medicines. So does this take out that bias? You were saying you're not getting rid of the bias.
Well, that's the thing, that when you have a person involved, throughout the process, you have somebody who is actually checking on the algorithm, checking on the data. So it's proactively working on this algorithm. We don't just build the algorithm and then just leave it to do whatever it wants.
Data, obviously you had a human looking at that as well. But the way they set it up, it was totally biased in the way they set it up.
Exactly. So the bias, the bias comes from people, right?
Yeah.
And it's going to. But I think what we're also talking about, and I don't want to misappropriate the word of bias, because it's also about the applicability to a 7 billion person population, right? And if you make the assumption that everybody is their own ecosystem, then actually you then start to create the algorithm from a point that actually you baseline yourself. So yours is based off of you, and it's going to look very different than mine, just because of the way we operate. And you know what? We can also put it on the dog as well, because the dog operates differently as well. It's interesting, they do have emotions and expressions. But it's a really good question. It's one of the reasons why we don't necessarily ascribe, as a company, we don't really ascribe to the universality approach to body language and facial expressions. I prefer to take much more of an anatomical approach, which is most people have this type of muscle structure. I can make that assumption, I think. And I think that if we solve that, then you can get into the nuanced edge cases like stroke victims and stuff like that, because that's where it might throw the algorithm.
Go ahead. One of the parameters on the model is thought.
Yeah.
So to what degree can you actually use people's thoughts?
Yeah. So maybe we have to work on the wording of that one, but it's claimed feedback. So thought really, when you look at that flow, you're saying a person. Now, typically unidentified, but if you have the identity, so if you noticed, it was flip back to it. So if you notice, it's identity, environment, emotion, thought, behavior. So who you are, where you are, how you feel, what you think, what you do. And the reason why, if you actually look at this, what you're actually looking at is the process from neuroscience pathway of going through an experience. Okay, you walk into an environment, this might be the environment, and every second you're doing this. You are a person that is in an environment, you have an emotion. An emotion is, let's call it a bouncer to the brain. It basically takes all of your neural signals and says, right, we're only letting 40 of the 11 million through. Okay? That goes into your memory encoding, which then eventually, the next measurement point that we can really get out, you can use some brave way analysis, but the next thing that you can really get out at scale in the wild is what then they say, because that typically precedes an action, but sometimes they just go straight to action. So that's how you can start to infer thought. That's our approach anyway. Yeah. I'm not saying it's right. It's the best that we've got working for us at the moment.
We're just about out of time. I want to come back and ask you guys one question across the board. If I'm a filmmaking company now, and I'm making film or I'm making a program or document, what's the one thing that I should be doing to leverage this thinking, this approach and technology to make to either make a better product or make my audience happy? What's the one thing I should be doing next? What should I be thinking about?
People. People should always come first. So when we talk about human-centered design, apply all methodologies you can apply to test your content. Always involve humans, always make humans first. That's why we're going through the design sprint process, so we can teach people to take this approach, not just look at data and technology, but look at humans first.
Okay, so you're saying so what it is, the design piece is all around getting people to think in the right way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, take the right approach.
Okay.
Because you can't use this data if you don't already have. It's really one of those things that kind of, the data is the fuel for a tool, but the tool's useless. If you don't know what the tool is, then you just have the fuel.
Okay.
And I think the design, I mean, look, it took me 6 years to figure out that this is what we needed, and I figured it out when I met Marlene. And we were kind of just jamming around kind of this whole area of emotions, and she was talking about her PhD and human-centered design at JLR, because the automotive is going to turn into the #1 engagements time period in somebody's life when it becomes self-driving, right? Because you don't, when we finally get there, you can change the interiors, you can have your living room on wheels. You no longer have to drive. So what? It's the #1 thing being targeted by media companies, because you get an extra 2 hours every day. So if you're going to do it, you have to know that once you have the data, then how do I make a decision with it? So the key is actually, you have to go back to the kind of basics of how you make a decision and how you use this information. So that's why we use the design approach. So when you're creating a film, We've been talking about this at length. When you create a film, how do you create an ecosystem where you can very quickly send to, and you can keep it close, like closed door and inner circle, send whatever it is, auditions, music that you're picking, trailers, full edits, whatever it is, cuts, whatever it might be. How do you then send that quickly to audience members that either you trust and you want to keep it private, or the more public audiences, get that feedback so that by the time it comes to the point of finalizing the film, you know where it's going, you know how to talk about it, you know the narrative you need to get it to in order to get it funded, if you want it, if that's the intent. If it's, I mean, another area where we're looking at governments, the Thai government is a really interesting one. So they have a challenge because they've got a lot of languages in Thailand, right? And a lot of different subgroups. So how do you create an anti-smoking ad when they all have very different approaches to smoking? So the really interesting use case. It's not always about money. It's about other fundamental
fragmented
drivers.
audiences.
Yeah, well, it's about creating a common system of assessment. And the only common thing in all of those areas is people. It's the only commonality. So instead of, yeah, no, go ahead.
I think another one that we're missing is context. So a lot of companies working in the same space are just looking at biometrics, but they're not looking at the data around it. And there's no point of just looking at biometrics if you don't have the rest of the information. And that's why we have this data model. That's why we're trying to include as much information as possible so we can make sense of it.
But emotions fundamentally are additive value. The only area is in the creative space. There is an element of diagnostic that can inform a creative, but quite frankly, I think storytellers should just be storytellers. Do what they do. As a data person, I would hate to restrict somebody from their creativity.
But as you said, they should have the information.
They should have it, because if they want to act on it, then they should have the access to it.
Thank you.
Last one question.
Last one.
Do you think they should rewrite Game of Thrones?
I have restricted myself from this final season because I've been on the road the entire time, so every day it was aired. So I'm waiting to binge watch it. Do not spoil it.
We haven't seen the last episode either. At least most of us haven't.
Super. Well, it just remains to thank yourself, Matt, Evgeniya, and Marlene. Thank you very much indeed for a fantastic session. That's been really insightful. I don't know what you think, but I've learned a whole pile this evening, and it's made me think about the world quite differently. So I hope it's been successful to you. Thank you very much for coming all the way down to speak to us.
Yeah,
and
pleasure.
And then thank you also, Grant Thompson and Freeze, very much for sponsoring us. And
thanks for having us.
Round of applause.